Colonel Whitmore dropped a wicker basket on Private Isla Crane's desk during morning formation and said one sentence that made the entire company go silent. "Your father couldn't finish what he started. Maybe you can." Inside were 47 letters, all unopened, all addressed to the Army Logistics Command from her father 20 years ago. Letters proposing a supply chain system that had been ignored, dismissed, and eventually forgotten. The colonel's tone suggested he expected her to be embarrassed by her father's failure. He had no idea that Isla had spent her entire childhood watching her father refine those ideas at their kitchen table, never knowing the Army had refused to even read them. Private First Class Isla Crane was 24 years old and currently standing in the supply office at Fort Hood, Texas, staring at a basket full of her father's rejected correspondence. The morning sun came through the windows at an angle that made the dust visible in the air, and she could hear the sounds of morning physical training echoing from across the base. Her hands were shaking slightly as she touched the envelopes, recognizing her father's handwriting. Even after all these years, Isla had been at Fort Hood for 8 months, working in logistics as a 92A automated logistical specialist. It was the same career field her father had worked in during his 20-year Army career, managing supply chains and inventory systems that kept units operational. She'd joined partly to honor his memory, partly because she'd grown up understanding logistics in ways most people never considered. Her father had died 3 years ago, and she thought she knew everything about his military service. The basket contained evidence that she'd been wrong, if you want to. Hear stories about veterans and their families who changed the Army from the inside. Hit that subscribe button. These are the legacies that deserve to be remembered. Isla's father, Master Sergeant David Crane, had been a logistics NCO who believed that supply chain efficiency wasn't just about moving equipment faster. It was about understanding patterns, predicting needs before they became urgent, and building systems that adapted to changing conditions. He'd spent years developing a framework for what he called predictive logistics, using historical data and operational patterns to forecast supply requirements with remarkable accuracy. Isla had grown up watching him work on these ideas at home. Their kitchen table had been covered with spreadsheets and diagrams, her father explaining how you could predict maintenance needs based on equipment age and usage patterns, how you could optimize transportation routes by understanding seasonal weather impacts, how you could reduce waste by matching supply levels to actual consumption rates rather than theoretical requirements. Her mother had been a data analyst for a civilian supply chain company, and she'd helped her husband refine his mathematical models. Together, they'd created something that Isla had always assumed was just an interesting hobby, a way for her father to stay mentally engaged with work he loved. She'd never known he'd tried to get the Army to implement these ideas, had never known he'd written dozens of detailed proposals, had never known they'd all been rejected without serious consideration. What she remembered most was her father's patience. He'd never seemed bitter or frustrated about his Army career. He'd served with pride, done his job excellently, and retired with honor. If he'd been disappointed that his ideas weren't adopted, he'd never let it show to his family. He'd just kept refining his systems, kept teaching Isla about logistics, kept believing that good ideas eventually found their way to the people who needed them. Sitting in that supply office, looking at 47 unopened letters, Isla realized her father had been more disappointed than he'd ever admitted, and that Colonel Whitmore had just given her the opportunity to finish what her father had started. Colonel Whitmore had discovered the letters while cleaning out old filing cabinets in preparation for a command inspection. They'd been shoved in the back of a drawer, filed under miscellaneous correspondence, never logged into any formal system. When he'd seen David Crane's name and realized his daughter was currently serving in his command, he'd apparently thought it would be amusing to return them to her. He'd made a small speech when he'd dropped the basket on her desk, loud enough for the other soldiers in the office to hear. He'd said that sometimes family legacy wasn't what we hoped it would be, that her father had meant well, but clearly didn't understand the complexity of Army logistics systems, that she shouldn't feel obligated to defend ideas that the Army had already determined were impractical, that the best way to honor her father's service was to focus on doing her current job well, rather than pursuing his rejected proposals. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, Isla's immediate supervisor, had looked uncomfortable during the whole interaction. After the colonel left, he told Isla quietly that Whitmore had a reputation for being dismissive of junior enlisted soldiers' ideas, that he ran the logistics office like his personal kingdom and didn't appreciate anyone suggesting improvements to established procedures. That Isla should probably just take the letters home and forget about them. Specialist Jordan Hayes, who worked at the adjacent desk, had been more direct. She'd said that Whitmore was threatened by anyone who knew more than him, which was basically everyone. That he'd been in his current position for 3 years and had successfully resisted every attempt to modernize their supply systems. That trying to implement ideas from 20-year-old letters written by her father would just make Isla a target for retaliation. But Lieutenant Sarah Okafor, the junior officer who managed their section, had pulled Isla aside later that morning and said something different. She'd told Isla that she should at least read the letters, that the Army's logistics systems were genuinely struggling with the same problems they'd had 20 years ago, that good ideas didn't have expiration dates, and maybe there was something valuable in her father's work. Isla spent that evening in her barracks room, reading through her father's letters one by one. Each envelope contained a detailed proposal, complete with statistical analysis, implementation plans, and projected cost savings. The writing was clear and professional, showing deep understanding of Army logistics operations and thoughtful consideration of how to improve them. What struck her most was the progression. The early letters were tentative, suggesting small improvements to existing systems. As the rejections accumulated, her father's proposals became more comprehensive, as if he thought the problem was that he wasn't explaining himself clearly enough. The final letters, written just before his retirement, contained a complete framework for predictive logistics that was remarkably sophisticated. She pulled out her laptop and started comparing her father's proposals to the current logistics system she worked with daily. The problems he'd identified 20 years ago were still problems today. Units still experienced supply shortages because the requisition system was reactive rather than predictive. Maintenance facilities still faced parts delays because inventory levels were based on outdated usage estimates. Transportation assets were still underutilized because route planning didn't account for operational patterns. Her father had seen all of this decades ago and had developed solutions that still made sense. Solutions that could save the Army millions of dollars and significantly improve operational readiness. Solutions that had been dismissed without serious evaluation because they'd come from an NCO rather than an officer, from the field rather than a planning office, from someone who understood the actual problems rather than the theoretical frameworks. What made Isla angry wasn't that the Army had rejected her father's ideas. Organizations made mistakes, and good proposals sometimes got lost in bureaucracy. What made her angry was Colonel Whitmore's assumption that her father had been foolish for trying. That attempting to improve Army systems was something to be embarrassed about rather than proud of. That legacy was something to be mocked rather than honored. She thought about her father working at their kitchen table, refining these ideas even after the Army had stopped responding to his letters. She'd always assumed he was doing it for himself, staying intellectually engaged with problems he found interesting. Now she wondered if he'd been doing it for her. If he'd kept developing these systems, knowing that someday she might be in a position to implement them. If he'd believed in her capabilities more than the Army had. Believed in his. Isla spent the next 2 weeks doing something that technically fell within her duties, but was far beyond what was expected of a junior enlisted soldier. She took her father's framework and updated it using current data from Fort Hood's logistics systems. She built spreadsheets that demonstrated how predictive logistics could reduce supply costs by 18%, while improving parts availability by 32%. She created implementation plans that could be tested at small scale before committing to base-wide changes. Lieutenant Okafor had noticed what she was working on and offered quiet support. She'd given Isla access to additional data sources and connected her with a captain in the planning office who specialized in logistics optimization. The captain, a West Point graduate named Torres, had looked at Isla's analysis and admitted that it was more sophisticated than anything his office had produced recently. Staff Sergeant Chen had been worried. He'd told Isla that building a comprehensive proposal on her own time was admirable, but presenting it to Colonel Whitmore was asking for trouble. That Whitmore didn't respond well to junior soldiers, showing initiative that made him look uninformed, that she should consider submitting her work through official channels where it might reach higher leadership without directly challenging the colonel's authority. But Isla had learned something from reading her father's letters. He'd tried working through official channels for years, and his proposals had been buried in bureaucracy. Sometimes the only way to get attention was to force the issue directly. Even if it meant accepting personal risk, she'd requested a meeting with Colonel Whitmore, officially logging it as a proposal for logistics system improvements. He'd agreed to see her, probably expecting a brief conversation where he could dismiss whatever minor suggestion she'd prepared. He had no idea she was bringing 2 years of work, both her father's original framework and her own updated implementation plans. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the colonel's office. By Thursday evening, word had spread through the logistics office that Private Crane was planning to challenge the colonel's systems directly. Specialist Hayes had told her she was committing career suicide. Staff Sergeant Chen had asked her to reconsider, or at least let Lieutenant Okafor present the proposal instead. Even Captain Torres had suggested that she might want to soften her approach, present the ideas as refinements rather than fundamental changes. Isla had thanked them all for their concern and kept preparing. Because she'd realized something important. Her father had spent 20 years being polite, being patient, being careful not to challenge authority too directly. And his ideas had died with him, filed away in the back of a cabinet where nobody would ever see them. Sometimes truth needed to be delivered like a hammer, not a suggestion. Colonel Whitmore's office was exactly what Isla had expected, walls covered with plaques and certificates, a desk that probably cost more than her monthly salary, and an expression that suggested he was already planning how to dismiss whatever she'd brought. Lieutenant Okafor had accompanied her as a witness, standing quietly near the door while Isla set up her laptop. She'd started by thanking the colonel for returning her father's letters, for giving her the opportunity to review his work and understand what he'd been trying to accomplish. Then she'd put her first slide on the screen, showing Fort Hood's current supply costs compared to the Army average. Fort Hood was 17% above average, despite having similar operational requirements to comparable bases. Whitmore had interrupted immediately, explaining that Fort Hood's costs were higher because of various unique factors that civilians and junior soldiers didn't understand. Isla had nodded politely and shown her next slide, which broke down those costs by category and demonstrated that the elevated spending wasn't in areas that matched the colonel's explanation. The excess costs were concentrated in predictable categories: rush orders for parts that should have been in stock, transportation inefficiencies from suboptimal routing, and inventory carrying costs from overstocking items with low usage rates. Each of her father's proposals had addressed one of these problems, and each of her updated analyses showed that the problems were actually worse now than they'd been 20 years ago. The Army had grown more dependent on reactive logistics, while operational tempo had increased, creating a system that was both expensive and unreliable. Whitmore's expression had changed from dismissive to defensive. He'd pointed out that the current systems were what headquarters required, that he didn't have authority to make major changes to established procedures, that implementing untested ideas from a retired NCO through his daughter would be professionally inappropriate. Isla had expected that response. She'd put up her final slide, showing that 3 other Army bases had independently developed similar predictive logistics systems in the past 5 years. All 3 had documented significant cost savings and improved readiness. All 3 were being studied by the Army Logistics University as potential models for service-wide implementation. Her father's framework wasn't untested or radical. It was a solution that the Army was slowly discovering on its own, 20 years after he'd first proposed it. The room had gone very quiet. Lieutenant Okafor had stepped forward and added that she'd already forwarded Private Crane's analysis to the Base Logistics Planning Office, and they'd requested permission to pilot test the framework in 1 battalion, that this was no longer just about honoring her father's memory. This was about solving real problems that were costing the Army real money and degrading real operational capabilities. Colonel Whitmore had looked at his computer screen, then at Isla, then back at the screen. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had been different, quieter, less certain. He'd asked why her father had never pushed harder for his ideas, why he'd accepted rejection so easily instead of fighting for what he believed was right. Isla had thought carefully before answering. She'd said that her father had believed in following proper channels, respecting authority, and trusting that good ideas would eventually be recognized. That he'd served with honor, and never became bitter about being ignored. But that maybe he'd been wrong about the proper channels. Maybe sometimes the only way to make the Army better was to bypass the people who were invested in keeping it the same. The pilot program launched 6 weeks later in 2nd Battalion, with Isla serving as technical advisor under Lieutenant Okafor's supervision. They implemented her father's predictive logistics framework on a limited scale, using historical data to forecast parts requirements and optimize inventory levels. Within 3 months, the battalion had reduced supply costs by 14%, while improving parts availability significantly. Colonel Whitmore had called Isla back to his office after reviewing the initial results. This time the meeting was different. He'd told her directly that he'd made a mistake 20 years ago when her father's proposals had come through his office. That he'd been a junior officer then, newly assigned to logistics planning, and he'd dismissed David Crane's ideas because they challenged established doctrine and came from an NCO rather than the planning staff. That seeing those same ideas prove successful now had forced him to confront his own biases and assumptions. He'd asked Isla what she wanted to do with her career, whether she planned to stay in logistics or pursue other opportunities. She told him honestly that she wanted to continue her father's work, helping the Army build more efficient and effective logistics systems. That she believed junior soldiers often had the best ideas because they saw the actual problems rather than the theoretical frameworks. Within 6 months, Fort Hood began implementing the predictive logistics framework across all battalions. The Base Logistics Planning Office invited Isla to help develop training materials and implementation guides. The Army Logistics University requested copies of her father's original letters, planning to use them as case studies in courses about innovation and organizational learning. The bigger change happened more quietly. Colonel Whitmore revised the command's policies for reviewing proposals from junior enlisted soldiers. He established a formal system where any soldier could submit improvement ideas directly to a review board, with mandatory evaluation rather than automatic dismissal. He told his staff publicly that David Crane's rejected proposals had cost the Army millions of dollars and years of innovation, and that kind of waste couldn't continue. Staff Sergeant Chen had pulled Isla aside one morning and told her that she'd done something remarkable, that she'd taken what could have been an embarrassing family legacy and turned it into meaningful change, that her father would have been proud. Isla wasn't sure about that. Her father had always been humble about his work, never seeking recognition or credit. But she thought he would have appreciated seeing his ideas finally implemented, seeing the systems he'd developed actually helping soldiers do their jobs better, seeing the Army become more efficient and effective in exactly the ways he'd envisioned decades ago. The basket of letters sat on her desk now, no longer a symbol of rejection, but a reminder of persistence. Her father had been right about his ideas, but he'd been too patient about getting them implemented. He'd trusted the system to recognize value on its own timeline. Isla had learned a different lesson. Sometimes truth needed to be forced into the light, even when it made people uncomfortable. Sometimes the only way to honor a legacy was to fight for it more aggressively than the original person had been willing to fight. The colonel had dumped those letters on her desk expecting embarrassment. Instead, he'd given her the foundation to change how an entire base managed logistics. Sometimes the best response to mockery was simply proving that the mocked ideas were right all along. Truth didn't need defenders. It just needed people willing to present it clearly enough that denial became impossible.